We're up here on top of Mt Marcy, just waiting for the sun to rise. Day 2 of the Northville Placid Trail is in the books. Well, life doesn't get much better than this open ridge walk on Jay Mountain, and we're at the summit of Lower Wolfjaw, our 8th high peak of the day here on the Great Range Traverse. Well, it's 4:30 a.m., heading a big slide today, and it's -4 degrees here at the parking lot. Bushwhacking our way up Green Mountain, and I have to say, the trees are winning this fight today. Well, the sun is shining and the wind is whipping here up on Haystack. Next stop, Saddleback Cliffs. Cock-a-doodle-doo from the summit of Rooster Comb. Scarface might be the most underrated hike in the entire park. 60-mile-an-hour winds up on Hurricane. Very fitting, cruising up the Bald Rock slab here on Bald Mountain. Standing up here on the summit of Catamount Mountain, Iroquois, Mount Van Hovenberg, Skylight, Santanoni. You're listening to the 46 of 46 podcast. August 8th, 1969. Thunderstorms surrounded the Adirondacks. Lightning crashed. Rain poured down as it often does in the summertime. A day better spent in your house rather than in the mountains. That summer day, F. Peter Simmons took flight from Long Island, New York in a borrowed Cherokee 140. Bound for the stormy Adirondacks to meet up with his family at their Tupper Lake summer home. He was a fairly new pilot, with roughly 370 hours of flight time, but since he had made the solo trek several times before from Long Island to the ADK, he knew the route pretty well. His family had their lovely summer home in Tupper Lake, and he usually flew direct to an airstrip close to his home. But things wouldn't quite go that smoothly on this flight. Midway through the flight from Long Island to Tupper Lake, knowing that the thunderstorms awaited him in the Adirondacks, Simmons decided to call an audible and landed prematurely in Albany, where he would wait for the poor weather to pass. The delay meant that landing at that grass strip near his Tupper Lake house would no longer be an option since there aren't any lights on that landing strip. So he chose an alternate destination, the Adirondack Regional Airport in Lake Clear. Before he took off from Albany, Simmons informed his wife of the change in his flight plans, so she knew to meet him at the Lake Clear Airport instead. And after a bit of time passed, along with the thunderstorms, Simmons was ready to go, and he fired up the Cherokee 140's engine and took flight once again into the upstate New York skies, heading north towards the Adirondack Mountains. The flight continued without incident. After all, Simmons had made this flight many times before. And then about 12 miles or so from the airport, it was time to begin his descent. This, however, was the beginning of every pilot and every pilot's family's worst nightmare. While descending, he realized fairly quickly that he could not level out the plane, and he continued to lose altitude rapidly at the rate of 1,100 feet per minute. He was caught in a severe downdraft directly over the MacIntyre Range in the high peaks. Simmons was keenly aware of what was happening in that moment above the Adirondack high peaks. He knew he was going down, a realization no pilot ever wants to have. But Simmons had no time to waste, and he acted swiftly. Recalling the instructions he had received as a student, he prepared for a crash and lifted the nose, thus slowing the plane down, and he cut the engines. Accepting the inevitable fate of a crash, he guided the plane down the best he could. He had no control over what would happen upon impact or where exactly that impact will take place. A harrowing thought for anyone who has spent time climbing in the high peaks or flying in an airplane. The plane continued to lose elevation as Simmons continued gliding through the night air towards the earth. Meanwhile, over at the Lake Clear Airport, F. Peter Simmons' wife, Dottie Simmons, awaited her husband's arrival. But as the clock passed his estimated time of arrival, the anxiety began to build up within her, a feeling every pilot's family member can relate to. She remained calm on the outside, but as the minutes ticked by, her nerves grew on the inside as she desperately looked for the lights of her husband's plane to appear. A plane that never would appear. Up in the sky, Simmons' plane continued to glide down through the Adirondack sky towards its inevitable demise. And then, impact. The tail hit first against the top of some trees, while other trees ripped the left wing directly off the plane upon impact, throwing the wing about into the forest and spinning the entire aircraft. The first impact all happened above ground in the trees, but the final impact was still to come, and with the amount of glacial erratics, cliffs, and rock slides in these mountains, could explode the plane into dust upon final impact. The plane finally hit the forest floor. It was down, and the crash was over. Back at the tiny Lake Clear airport, his wife Dottie could feel something wasn't right, and it was time to contact Messina Flight Control and report her husband's plane missing. Tail number N6483R. It was well after midnight now, and Flight Control told Dottie that her husband reported in on approach 12 miles out just before midnight, but they could no longer raise him on the radio. The possibility that he had landed at another strip was offered to her, but that seemed unlikely and was of no comfort, so there was nothing more she could do directly. Dottie then left the airport and drove back to Tupper Lake in complete despair. She knew something was wrong. Their Tupper Lake home was a water access only house, so Dottie then drove the motorboat back to their house where their 15-year-old son Gordon awaited their arrival. Gordon recalled the events of that fateful summer night, saying, "I remember hearing the loud noise of the inboard motor waking me up early in the morning, and I immediately knew something was wrong." His instincts were correct. Many miles deep in the now quiet Adirondack wilderness, in the Cold Brook Pass, between Iroquois and Mt Marshall, surrounded by trees, sat the remains of the Cherokee 140. But inside the cockpit, miraculously, F. Peter Simmons was alive. Unconscious, but he was alive. He suffered severe traumatic facial injuries and spent most of the night unconscious in the pilot chair. The safety belt in that model plane was not a shoulder harness, but simply a basic lap belt, which didn't prevent his face from violently slamming into the control panel upon impact. Incredibly, the main body of the aircraft, known as the fuselage, crashed to the ground intact with relatively little damage. A crash landing that could have been, and in the Adirondacks usually is, much, much worse. As the sun rose on August 9th, more than 20 planes began searching for the missing Cherokee. The Civilian Air Patrol was in charge of the massive effort. Pilot Tom Parker was flying his plane over the MacIntyres with an observer, Gene McArdle, when they made the discovery around 2:45 p.m. A reflection caught their eye as the sun bounced off the metal in the canopy. Looking down, they could hardly believe their eyes. It was a man in a business suit, standing on the wing, waving what looked like a red flag. Or actually, as it would turn out, was a bloody handkerchief. Simmons was still alive. Ecstatic, Parker reported the finding. And this was an era well before GPS, and Parker had difficulty pinpointing the exact location of the wreck, and he mistakenly reported it as being on Mt Marcy, not Mt Marshall. Legendary Adirondack Forest Ranger Gary Hodgson was on patrol on Mt Marcy at the time when the discovery was made. Incredibly, it was news to him that there was even a plane missing in the area, and backcountry search and rescue missions were not as well coordinated back then as they are today. Fortunately for F. Peter Simmons, if there ever was a single man you wanted looking for you when you were lost or injured, it was Ranger Hodgson. To quote Ranger Hodgson, "For some reason, things in the woods imprinted on me. I could close my eyes and see specific trees, rocks, and I could just recall routes and terrain. I could lay in bed with my eyes closed and remember details, images, and the quickest way to get places." While patrolling that morning, hikers on the trail asked him if he was searching for the missing plane. "Missing plane?" he replied to them before retreating to the Marcy Dam outpost, which was one of only 2 locations with landline telephones, the other being the Lake Colden outpost. Ranger Hodgson called out to the Lake Placid Airport manager, Steve Short, to find out what was going on. It wasn't until that evening when Ranger Hodgson finally spoke to pilot Tom Parker via telephone about what he had seen from the air earlier that day. The rescue mission was well underway as numerous state troopers began making their way into the woods, first via truck up the Marcy Dam truck trail and then on foot. Thankfully, Hodgson's 80K backcountry experience came into play as he spoke at length with the pilot, who believed Simmons' plane went down on Mt Marcy. But Hodgson felt, based on the information, that the plane was actually across Lake Colden on the MacIntyre Range, possibly near Cold Brook Pass between Marshall and Iroquois. Cold Brook itself flows right past the Lake Colden outpost, and back in 1969, a marked hiking trail began there going directly through the pass between Mt Marshall and Iroquois, rising to 3,900 feet before descending to the Indian Pass Trail to the west. That trail still exists in some form, however, it has technically been abandoned. Ranger Hodgson and the caretaker Al Jordan hiked together to the Lake Colden outpost, where they began their ascent in search of the missing pilot and the crash site. The sun set and night fell as the two hiked and searched via headlamp. Upon getting up in elevation, Hodgson developed a rapid search plan and shared it with Jordan. Knowing the plane is somewhere in the saddle, the plan was to walk back and forth between the trail and Mt Marshall, turning around when they would start to hit elevation, and zigzagging. This sort of search and rescue effort in the dark is extra challenging in the thick Adirondack forest because they could easily walk past the plane without even noticing it, just outside the beam of their headlamp, camouflaged against the black landscape. The two continued with Hodgson's search and rescue plan, looking for a needle in a pitch-black, evergreen and hardwood-filled haystack. And then another miracle happened. Some may call it luck. Others would call it divine intervention. The only person who knows where this plane is the good Lord, the ranger said to the caretaker. Suddenly, in that moment, an immense gust of wind howled through the Cold Brook Pass, seemingly sent from the heavens. Hodgson described it as sounding like a door slamming, a sound that would never be miles and miles and miles deep in the woods. Honing in on that strange sound, they did it. They found the plane. And it sat just 150 feet away from the pass trail. Part of the airplane was acting as a sail, capturing the wind, causing it to move about, thus creating the sound the two men had heard moments earlier. Inside the plane sat F. Peter Simmons. He was alive. It had been 21 hours since the crash at this point. A battered and bruised Simmons was semi-conscious and no longer bleeding, but he was alive.